All right. Thank you for having me. Today I'll talk about a topic that is very dear to me. It's about combining supplements and drugs for longevity. And let's see. I'll talk to you as a scientist first and as a biohacker as well. So this is an important question because people are already combining lots of supplements. They call it like stacks. And often you will see researchers posting criticism and saying, you know, this will kill you. They will say this with a lot of confidence. But I want to really look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? What do we know? And in principle, it makes sense that you would like to combine things because we know that aging is multifactorial. And you can also perhaps improve the side effect profile of the drugs or supplements that you're taking. We're going to explore this in the next couple of slides. But what I want to emphasize that we really don't know. There is very little evidence, so we have to have some intellectual humility to say neither the critics nor the supporters of really heavy supplementation know the truth. And I will walk you through my own approach to supplementation, a brief story from my own way of supplementing, and later about the evidence that we know from animal models and human studies. Just very briefly, how I look at risks and benefits, and I won't go into the math here, but basically, I'm trying to maximize the expected value of my supplements or drugs, how much they can extend my lifespan. So that considers both benefits and harms. But you could have a supplement that gives you an average lifespan increase of 5 years, that has both high risks and high benefits, right? That would be a supplement with a sort of higher volatility. And even though it gives you the same mean lifespan increase as a different supplement, which has both less risks and less benefits. So it's just a priori not trivial to say what is more important. And to give you an example how this could look, if you have a supplement that is sort of high risk, high benefit, if it is given to a population of mice here, for example, in orange, it could look like this. You have early an increase in mortality, and later you have a decrease of mortality. And this might be good for you because maybe you really, really want to be alive in the future, like Brian Johnson, who says that we will have amazing medical advances in the future, also known perhaps as escape velocity, AGI, etc. And we do actually observe this when we do mouse studies. There are drugs or interventions that really produce this kind of survival where you have early mortality that is later then balanced by better survival, right? So you personally have to make this choice for yourself, what kind of risk you want to take and whether you would like to take this kind of drug or not. And so as I say, this is actually also a personal preference question, so it's not a purely scientific one, like how much risk you would like to take, what kind of volatility you accept in terms of outcomes. And to give you an example from myself, a while ago, I took a drug for skin called isotretinoin. It helps to clear up acne. It is known to be really, really potent, but also have to potentially severe side effects. It dries out your skin and temporarily also dries out your eyes. Usually this subsides after you stop taking this drug. But now many years after I took this drug, I developed quite early onset, relatively severe dry eye disease. But this highlights we don't know. This is like an N of one story, right? We don't even know if our own side effects can be linked to a drug that we've taken a long time ago. And we have to emphasize that the control trials also cannot tell us what are the long-term benefits and the long-term harms because most trials are really short. And we also may, in the future, regret choices we've made. So our own risk tolerance as biohackers or as consumers might also change. So perhaps today, thinking back, I believe I should not have taken this risk, right? So there are a lot of complex choices that we have to make when we try to improve our health and extend our life. And sometimes we will make mistakes. Now, however, nevertheless, I'm still a believer in combining different drugs and supplements. So these are a few of the things that I take. And in the interest of time, I won't go into details, but I'm happy to take questions later in the Q&A or during the coffee break about this stuff. I would rather like to look at the evidence and sort of the underlying philosophy of how we should look at combinations of drugs and supplements. Now think for a second, what happens if you eat your veggies, you eat carrots, you eat broccoli, you eat meat, then you go for a run, And this also releases hundreds of different myokines in your blood. So every time you do this, you're exposed to already a complex array of bioactives and things that push your metabolism in a certain direction. So if there were really common catastrophic risks of such combinations, shouldn't people just be dropping dead from all these dietary bioactives that they consume? I think that gives us at least an intuition that combinations perhaps are not as toxic as a lot of doctors and scientists would make us believe. But to us scientists also it means perhaps these rare interactions do exist and we need to study them. We need larger cohort studies with large populations to really capture them. And it's also possible that there are rare interactions of supplements or dietary bioactives that are extremely beneficial, right? And we also don't know about them because they're so rare. Now, what do we know about combining different bioactives and lifestyle interventions, right? I mean, there are so many different molecules that you take in through the diet, right? This is just a small subset that I show you. They're very chemically diverse things that we find in the diet. And what happens to people that have a good dietary pattern where they can get a lot of bioactives and let's say do exercise. So for example, here going from Q1 to Q5, those people are healthier, they have more such patterns. Of course, they have less cardiometabolic disease. But what we often see in these studies are also diminishing returns, right? So based on cohort studies, I would reason that a lot of the supplements we take and the things we do, the health behaviors, they will be additive, but perhaps there will be diminishing returns. We don't always see diminishing returns in cohort studies of healthy behavior, but we do see them. So that's something to consider for us. Now we also have to consider, what do we take? Are they drugs or supplements? Many drugs have highly specific targets like rapamycin, for example, and they're potent and selective at a very low dose. Compare this with AKG, for example, which also might extend lifespan, just like rapamycin, but it is usually taken at a higher dose, and it is a substance that is endogenously found in the body. So these could behave totally different when you combine them, and we have to admit that we simply don't know enough to really answer whether supplements and drugs will behave differently in terms of combinations. And there is a very, very cool example that I would like to mention. Going back a few slides to the bioactives, you could argue that we evolved to tolerate dietary bioactives. That's why they're not harmful. And this could very well be true. If you look at bananas, for example, you eat 2 of them and they provide up to 1 gram of potassium. But it's illegal to sell a supplement with 1 gram of potassium, not because it's bad for the heart, but these supplements have been linked with gastrointestinal perforations. Why? Because they release the potassium in a very concentrated part locally in the intestine, right? So this is just a small change from the way we ingest a dietary bioactive. It made it harmful. But alternatively, there are probably also supplements that are more beneficial than the original bioactives that we consume. It is very, very dependent case by case, right? So you really should dig into the literature yourself for each supplement and intervention. And let me skip that. Just to give you a few common examples of real-world toxicities that you could encounter. It's true that many supplements are mild liver irritants, like for example, green tea extract. If you combine too many of this, there is no doubt that this would be harmful. So you have to investigate that. A lot of these supplements are mild inhibitors of mTOR. If you inhibit mTOR too much, this would be probably harmful. Also, a lot of these mild irritants are beneficial. They are induce hormesis, right? But hormesis always has a window. So if you take too many, this would not be beneficial. But of course, not all supplements and drugs act through hormesis. So again, it depends on what you're taking. But there are certainly risks. And also the gastrointestinal irritation. What happens if you combine 5 or 10 supplements that are all irritating to the stomach over 10 years? No one knows, right? And finally, supplements cost money. So you have to ask yourself, do you really want to spend the time and money on this, or do you want to invest it in science, like, donate it to science? I mean, there are opportunity costs for sure. Now let's briefly look at what we know from animal systems, right? What happens if you feed combinations to them? This is in worms. Professor Jan Gruber is also in Singapore, right? He's one of my colleagues, supervisors. He found that actually feeding combinations was usually either neutral or beneficial for the lifespan of worms. So that would be also my expectation on average if you take different supplement combinations. There are also more recent studies here from 2024 looking at pairwise combinations of drugs. To give you a summary of what happened, so this is plotted the mean lifespan extension with the single drug in gray and the mean lifespan extension of the combination in green. You can see that combining was beneficial. It produced a larger benefit, but there was also more variability in the outcome. This is more or less what I would expect. Now, of course, this is just warm data. What happens in flies? Just very briefly, interestingly, two groups found totally different things. Moskalev group in Russia did a free drug combination, including rapamycin. It barely did anything for the fly lifespan. In contrast, Linda Partridge combined also up to 3 drugs, and it worked beautifully. All of them were additive in Drosophila. So this is a little bit more complex than the warm data, but there's definitely no evidence that these would be harmful or catastrophically harmful, as a lot of scientists or doctors worry. Now, perhaps more interesting for us is, of course, mouse data, because we're all mammals, so maybe I'll spend a bit more time on this. There's the famous interventions testing program in the US. They usually test single compounds, but sometimes they also test combinations, for example, including rapamycin or botanicals like green tea extract. And there is no evidence that any of them were harmful. And for some of these combinations, they seemed more beneficial than the single agent. So that's probably the future. There is also Aubrey de Grey's mouse work that I'll explain in the next few slides. And 20 years back, Steven Spindler did a lot of work on dietary compounds. So I also talk about this. But overall, there is very, very little data, even in mice, to inform us on supplementation and combinations. Now, this is just a slide from Aubrey de Grey, right? The survival curves of his female mice. In blue is the survival of the controls. You can see that most curves look better. So on average, all these combinations in his study were beneficial to female mice. However, in his male mice, again from Aubrey's study, blue is again the control, some of the combinations and agents were harmful, whereas others were beneficial. So here it's more of a mixed bag, but still a trend towards combinations being beneficial. Perhaps even more important or interesting to us is the work of Steven Spindler going back to the early 2000s. So he worked a lot with combinatorial supplements that were available back then, also a bit with drugs. He tested dozens of cohorts of mice. Overall, he found that almost nothing changed mouse lifespan. So you don't have to worry about toxicity, but it's possible that a lot of these combination supplements at least won't extend lifespan. There were 2 top hits in Spindler's work. 2 drugs together were beneficial. That was an interesting finding. And 1 combination, this algae combo, shown to the right, was actually harmful. And this was a supplement that contained almost everything you can imagine. And so this is a list of the things that you can find in this algae combo supplement. A lot of these are still popular. A lot of these were popular in the late 90s, right? He never tested liver or kidney function, these mice. We don't know why they lived shorter. It could have been just that the dose was too high. It would be interesting to take another look in the future at other combination supplements, right? More modern ones. And also just very briefly, a few words about genetics. Usually when you look at SNPs and GWAS studies, so human genetics, most models assume that they act additively. Also when you do CRISPR screens in yeast, rarely do we find really very large interactions between pathways. That is because a lot of our pathways are buffered through feedback loops. So you wouldn't expect huge negative or positive synergies, except in rare cases. Now, finally, one of the last few slides, what do we know from the human clinic, right? We say that polypharmacy is harmful in the elderly, but this is like an empirical statement because old people take many drugs because they are already sick. But whenever you give multiple drugs in the form of a polypill to healthy people, in terms of primary prevention or secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease, it works beautifully, right? Similarly, for cancer treatments, people go up to 7 or 10 compounds for combinatorial regimens. And also there's recently beautiful data in hypertension emerging, so you can lower blood pressure by using a combination of 4 drugs. Each one you give at a lower dose, and you actually reduce the side effects, but you get a similar blood pressure lowering. So really, I believe that these combinatorial treatments are the future of pharmacology, and FDA should make it easier to get them approved, of course. And just one last slide about our own work. We looked at a cohort of very healthy people, around 4,000 people, and their biological ages. And we compared those who took 0, 1 to 4 supplements, or 5+ supplements in terms of biological age. What do we see? Everyone who took supplements in this cohort was biologically younger, but there was no dose response. So taking more supplements didn't turn out to be better on average, which doesn't mean that there aren't unique combinations of supplements that would be very beneficial, but at least on average, it did not produce additional benefits in this cohort of super healthy volunteers. Now, just to sum up, we really don't know much about this. It's an under-researched topic, but based on the literature I've seen, I would assume that taking 1 to 10 supplements, drugs, you would expect them to be additive with diminishing returns, but you have to look at each individual supplement and treatment, of course, at the evidence. Now, there are a lot of open questions in the field. I'll just pick up maybe one of them. So the question is, would it be more dangerous to combine drugs than supplements because the drugs are more specific and more potent? We don't know. Do you want to combine supplements and drugs that hit the same pathway, or drugs and supplements that hit highly distinct pathways? We also don't know for sure, but there's beautiful data using rapamycin and trametinib in flies, for example, showing lifespan extension, and they both inhibit anabolism. So that's mostly it. So what I also want to say is we studied supplements developed in the early 2000s. There were the studies of Spindler, but there are different companies producing more modern combinatorial supplements. No one tested them for lifespan. It would be great if we could do it. I worked briefly with a company called Xandro, but there are also other new supplements that are sold as longevity enhancing, and we know so little. We need more funding, more mouse studies, human studies on these. So that's the team we have in Singapore. I work with Professor Brian Kennedy, and I'm happy to take your questions.
老师你好，想请问一下关于我们40岁以后没有生育需求的中年人，雷帕霉素的一个推荐用量，还有它使用间隔，还有它是否是需要终身的服用？谢谢。
Well, we don't really have much human data yet. So you can always look up the regime recommended by Matt Kebeline, who is one of the leading researchers of rapamycin. He suggests intermittent dosing. There's also a study ongoing by Yusin Su, who will study rapamycin for ovarian aging, which might answer this question. But yeah, low-dose intermittent dosing is generally preferred by the biohackers who take rapamycin.
Can you talk a little bit more about the dosage of vitamin D? It seems that there are some controversies on the dosage. Some say 5,000 IU or even 10,000 is okay, and some suggest substantially lower. And what about the combination of vitamin D and vitamin K? Does that actually justify a higher level of vitamin D?
Yeah, I love this question. So I looked a bit into this, and you know, a lot of the early vitamin D data was based on cohort studies, which have their own biases. But yeah, recent recommendations push it slightly lower. Especially, I like the 2,000 units that were tested in the VITAL study with some minimal benefit on cancer mortality. So I'm in the range, and as far as blood levels are concerned, I'm aiming for closer to 30 nanograms per milliliter. I think that was more closer to the optimal in recent cohort studies, so I'm not a super big fan of those high doses. As for vitamin K, by itself, there is some weak evidence it helps with cardiovascular atherosclerosis calcification. It does not change my recommendation for vitamin D, but it is acceptable to take them together, I would say, yeah.
We have one more question. Can I ask how you made your strategy when you talk about the trade-off between the gain and the loss? I mean, ultimately, we know the conclusion is there's no definite solution for each one individually, but we have to make the decision based on the literature we read, right? Can you talk a little bit about your game theory strategy regarding the choice? Thank you.
Yeah, I kept this slide very short, and I didn't talk about it. So when I choose a supplement or a drug, what I like to look at is a signal for lifespan or slowing of aging in animals. And at the same time, I'm looking for some clinical data showing, let's say, cardiometabolic benefit in humans, blood pressure lowering, so that if this one doesn't work out, you at least get the other benefit. And then I take something in the intersection. For example, I really like cocoa powder. So it reduces the extract, it reduces blood pressure, and it has some longevity data in rats and other animals, for example.